Hello everyone, welcome to the fifth video of Figma plugin development. In the previous video, we had developed our own default template Figma plugin. It was a detailed step-by-step walkthrough and I'm sure you were able to develop your own Figma plugin. Now starting with this video, we're going to deep dive into understanding the APIs which are offered by Figma and how we can carry out actions like manipulating a layer or even inserting new elements from scratch. Now this video is again going to be a step-by-step walkthrough and we're going to make use of Figma developer documentation and try out those APIs using VS Code. So let's get started. Alright, so the topic of this video is understanding Figma APIs. So without any wait, let's get started. So what are nodes? Now before jumping into any technical part where we understand the APIs or even talk about some complex stuff, I want to take this very simple element and make it very clear for you because we are going to use this term a lot from this video to reaching towards the end video of this series. So for me, it's really important that you understand what are nodes. And I'm sure when you get to know what exactly are nodes, you will be like, dude, was it even necessary to talk about it? Because it's that simple. But yeah, I still believe that it's really important for us to know that. So let's try and understand what are nodes. Now, nodes are just the layers in your document which you see in the left hand side panel in the Figma application. Now, if you are a Figma designer or a Figma developer who is using Figma as a tool, you would have seen the left side panel, right? And you will see all the layers over there. Exactly all those layers are just termed as nodes by Figma plugin developer just to sound technically cool. So now, whenever you find me talking about nodes in this video or any other video after this, I am referring to layers as a whole. So don't confuse yourself. Nodes equals to layers. Now, where does it all starts? Now that we have a good understanding of what are nodes, how do we even approach any Figma plugin, right? What are the things that we need to know before using any API which is available? We need to make some decisions before even straight jumping into these APIs, right? So in my plugin development experience, I have figured out there are only these two types of plugin that you are going to majorly develop in your whole plugin development journey. Either you will always select the existing elements which is there in the artboard to manipulate, or you will add something from scratch using any plugin that you develop. So majority wise, you're going to do only these two actions, and that's why I think we need to break down these two actions and understand how can we approach them so that we can build a foundation of any plugin that we are developing. So let's start with the first action, which is selecting the existing element to manipulate. Now, here also we have two ways to select elements. Now the first way is to select whatever user has selected before running the plugin. Now if you would have used any Figma plugin, you would have observed that there are some plugins which asks you to select something before you run them, and that is one way to get the selection element that you want to manipulate with your plugin. Now another way is also to select all the elements of that particular document or to select only one element using a condition that we provide to it. So assume we are building a plugin where we want to, let's say, change the font family for particular text layers and replace it with something else, or else assume we are building a plugin where we want to rename the layers in that document. Now instead of asking users to manually select individually layer by layer, we can just run our plugin and make it select everything which is there using node.findAll and give it a condition like type equals to rectangle, so that it will only run on rectangle, or type equals to text, so that it will only run on text. Now this way we don't have to ask user to manually select such text elements. We as a developer can just traverse through that document and select the elements that we want to manipulate. So yeah, these are the two ways how you can select any element in the document. Now we are going to try them out on VS Code. So now you can open VS Code and follow me in trying out these two selection methods. So now we are inside our VS Code, and don't worry about the code in front of you. This is exactly the same project folder which we had created in our previous video to write down our very first Figma plugin. And if you remember, this was the project name, test plugin FPD. So yes, you can go ahead and open this project folder itself, and we're going to make use of this project configuration only and create the necessary required files for us to test out the things we are learning today, and consider it like a playground. So we are not creating a new project as such for now. We are only using the existing project. But I would recommend you to create a fresh new project when we are building our plugin from scratch in our later videos. So for now, we can use the existing project here itself. So let's see how our plugin is working, the one which we had created in our previous video. So when you go to Figma app and you right click and run the plugin from here, you will see that this opens a modal for us and it asks for an input for us to create that many number of rectangles. So let's go ahead with 5 and create, and you can see that it's creating 5 rectangles for us on the artboard. So now we know that our plugin is working as expected. So let's go back to VS Code and try out the APIs that we want to learn. So we can go ahead and close these files like code.ts and ui.html, and so let's go ahead and create two new files. We can call the first one as test.ts, and we can create another one and let's call it test.html. So these are the two files that we will be using for writing our TypeScript and HTML. So as you know, Figma environment consumes the code from a JavaScript file, but we haven't created one yet, right? So what we need to do is we need to run the compiler, which can do this task for you, which can convert your test.ts file into a test.js file that will be later consumed by the Figma environment. So as you can see, it will create a test.js file over here. So now we have our test.js file. So as you can see, all these files are empty because we haven't written any of our code as of now. But as and when we are writing our code in this file, it will be automatically reflected in this file because our compiler is running in the background. So there is one more thing that we should update before we start with writing the code for test.ts and test.html file. So if you remember, we had discussed about manifest.json file in our previous video, where we had discussed that this file is the one which is responsible for routing your TypeScript and your HTML file. So we need to update this file and tell it that now it should watch for test.ts or let's say in this case test.js file, because if you remember, Figma environment consumes directly from JavaScript, and once we have this test.ts converted into JavaScript, it is called as test.js, and the HTML file for us here is test.html. So just make sure you do that before running the plugin. Now that we have done that, let's go ahead and write the code for our very first API that we want to try out. So if you remember, in the previous slide we had discussed that the first case that we want to try out is that where a user is selecting something and then they are running the plugin to manipulate their user selection, right? So we have to think of a scenario where we can try a basic code to use that API so that we can, try and see how it comes out for us. So let's go ahead and think about it. So we can actually build a plugin which can deal with opacity. So let's say if user is selecting something in their document and then they're running the plugin, so they can have an option to update the opacity for the layers, or let's say for the nodes that they have selected. And this can be applied for single as well as multiple layers. So yeah, let's go ahead and write the code for that, where a plugin can change the opacity of any user selected node. So if you think of it from the base level UI, where how we are going to present this in terms of modal that the user will interact with, we need to show them some heading so that they get the idea of what this plugin does. So let's say I create a H1 heading and call it opacity master. So you can name this anything. It's just a UI. It's just a title of your plugin. Feel free to name it anything. And then later I also want to present them with a label where they can provide the input of the opacity which they want to change. So let's say enter new opacity, something like this. And here I can have my input field where I can capture all the input which they are providing. So let's say I give it a type of text because I want to capture the text input. And let's say I give it an ID of input box. Now this ID is something which I will be using when I'm writing my JavaScript to refer to this individual input field, and I can give it a default value as well. So if the user have not entered any value in this input field, let's have it, as it like 50. So now we have our input box and a label ready. Now let's create a button as well, which user can interact with. So let's call it apply opacity, something like this. And then again, we can give this an ID, which will be again used for referring while writing our JavaScript. So this is your apply opacity, and let's go ahead and create another button. So now that we have an option for them to update the opacity, let's also have an option where they can exit the plugin if they don't want to use this plugin. So let's call it exit, and we can give it an ID. Let's say exit plugin. And now we have two buttons over here. We can get started with writing our script tag, where we can define the logic, define the JavaScript logic of how this input fields and how this buttons should interact and how should they respond to the user's interaction. So let's go ahead and write a code which should work in case when we are pressing this apply opacity button. So to do that, we can write document dot get element by ID, because we have given an ID to this tag over here, and we can specify the ID which we have given. Let's say apply opacity, and then we can write dot on click, which is a JavaScript function to help us basically act on the button press which is happening over here. So now whatever line of code which I enter over here will be executed only if the user clicks on this button which we have over here. And we can do the same for exit plugin button as well. Let's just copy and paste it and just change the ID over here, because the ID for exit button is exit plugin, and we'll paste it over here. So now let's think about the action that should happen when the user is pressing this apply opacity. So what I want when a user should press this button is, I want first of all to capture the input which they have given me, and use that input to manipulate the layer which they have selected. Now in my HTML, I definitely don't have any idea of the layer which they have selected. So I need to capture the input and pass it to my test.ts file over here, so that I can receive an input from my HTML file and act on the layer which the user has selected. So let's do one thing. Let's take that input which the user is entering and pass it to our JavaScript, or let's say TypeScript file which we have over here. So what we can do is we can create a variable, let's say constant input box, and we can give it a reference to our input field which we have over here. So we can call it document dot get element by ID again, because we have an ID over here, and the ID for this one is input box. Now that we have this reference to this input field, we can get the value for that. So apply, or let's say opacity value, and this value can be again received from the reference of this input field which we have. So we can use this value, but I would prefer using a function called parseInt, where I can make sure that whatever value the user is entering is converted into the decimal value which I want. So I can use input box dot value, and I can give a second parameter as the radix value, the decimal base. So here I want it as 10, and yeah. So now I'm converting my input value which I'm receiving over here into a number which I'm storing in a variable. So now that we have captured the input from the user, let's use this input and pass it to our TS file which we have over here, because we are going to use this value as the opacity value that we're going to apply on the layer which the user wants to manipulate. So if you remember, we have learned about passing and receiving messages in Figma plugins in our previous video in the section called how plugins run. So we had talked about this method called parent.postMessage, which is responsible for mainly sending the message from the HTML file, and we will be receiving this message in our test.ts file, where we will be acting on that message. But for now, let's pass this message, and we can write it by parent.postMessage, and we can define our message over here. So let's say we call it plugin message, and inside this plugin message we can have a type of this message, and this type is something which will be useful for us again in our test.ts file to differentiate between the multiple messages that we will be passing. So we will be also passing a message in this method, right? So in case if we are passing multiple method, we need to have a distinction between these two methods. So we are defining a unique type to each of this method. So let's say the type of this message could be apply opacity, and along with this message type, we can pass the value, which is opacity value, which we have captured from the user. And along with that, there's a very important parameter that I also want to talk about. So we are also passing this asterisk over here. Now the reason why we are passing this asterisk is that whenever we are passing a post message, right, it needs to have some authentication to reach to the TypeScript file which is there. Now, instead of adding an authentication token, if we add an asterisk, then we are giving it a permission that it can pass the message to any file available. So that's why you need to make sure that you define this authentication parameter over here, which is asterisk in our case. And yeah, now we have successfully defined the message that we want to pass, which is the type of the message and the value attached with that message. Now let's go ahead and define the action which should happen on click of exit plugin, which we have here, this button. So when a user clicks on exit, what should happen? So if you remember, we have already duplicated the same thing. We have defined the on click method. Now let's just enter the line of code that should be executed. So similar to the previous method, here also we are going to pass a message to our test.ts file. So we can exactly just go ahead and copy this line and paste it over here. But in this case, the message will be different. So as I said, the type is something that we want to keep it unique so that there's a distinction between these two messages. So let's call this as exit message, or let's say just exit plugin. That works actually, and we don't need to pass any value in this case. We if the user is planning to exit, there's no need of passing the value. They just want to exit the plugin. So yeah, this is the message which we will be passing in case if a user clicks on exit. So now we have our basic HTML ready for user to interact with. Now let's define our TypeScript file as well, where we will be receiving these messages that we have passed over here, and we'll be acting on these messages. So whenever you're writing your TypeScript file, right, you should make sure that you first of all define this show UI function, which will render your HTML file which you have defined. So this is really important for your plugin environment to create an iframe and load all the HTML which you have defined over here. So please make sure you write this line. And after that, so if you remember, we have passed the message over here. Now we need to receive this message, and to receive this message, we can write this function called figma.ui.onMessage, and we can store this in a object called message, and later we can act on this object. So let's go ahead and define some conditions which should run some line of code based on the type of message which have been passed. So if you remember, we have defined multiple types in the message while we were passing them. So one of the type was let's say apply opacity. So in this case, if a user is clicking on apply opacity button, this message will be passed, and when this message is passed, this is received over here, and the line of code which we define under this bracket will run in case of this message type. Now let's define the other message type as well, which is in case if a user intends to exit the plugin. So if you remember, the message type in this case was exit plugin. Let's go ahead and write that, and this will be the code for the user who wants to exit the plugin. Now let's just go ahead and write a simple line over here, which is figma.close plugin, and I think it's pretty much self-explanatory that this line of code will completely close the plugin in case if the user wants to. But we are more interested in what happens if a user clicks on apply opacity, right? How do we get the user selection, and how do we manipulate that user selection? Now let's go ahead and write the code for that. So to get the user selected layer, what we have to do is we have to first of all write a for loop, because in this case a user selection could be either a single layer or a multiple layer. So this is stored as an array, and to traverse on that array, we need to make a use of a for loop in this case. So let's go ahead and write a for loop over here, and we can define a array called node, and we can run this node over figma.currentPage.selection. Now, this is an important line of code which I want to talk about, and this is the actual main reason why we are trying out this whole example. So, if you remember from the previous slide, which where we had discussed that we want to manipulate or we want to work upon the user selected layer, and to get that, we have this function in Figma which is called figma.currentPage.selection. Now, this function returns uh, the user selected layer or layers, and this could be either single value or multiple value, and that's why we need to store it in an array instead of just a normal variable. Now let's go ahead and traverse on this complete array which we are having. Now what we want to do is, if you remember, we want to update the opacity of the user selected layer. Now that we have got the access to the user selected layer, which is node, we should go ahead and write the code to update the opacity of that node. So for now, I'll just give a random value, and later on we can apply the value which we are getting as a user input. So let's say I give it a value of 50. Now this should update my user selected layer to 50% opacity. But you might be wondering that there is an error happening over here, and what exactly is that error? So let's go ahead and figure that out. So if you see over here, it says that property opacity does not exist on scene node and it does not exist on slice node. So this is again because of using the TypeScript. It is helping me understand the runtime error that can occur, and that's one of the reasons why you should write your code in TypeScript. Now to explain you what exactly this error means is that it is saying us that not every layer or not every node that user selects would have this opacity. Because if you consider in Figma, there's a node type called slice, and in that slice, it will not have opacity as a property at all. So we need to make sure that whichever layer or whichever node the user has selected has at least this property opacity, and then only we go ahead and manipulate that opacity. Otherwise, if it does not have that property opacity and we are trying to do that, then our plugin will fail and it will just stop running. So we need to write a validation where we can check if this opacity is present or not. So let's say we can write if opacity in node. Now this will check if my node is having opacity or not, and according to that, it will run the line of code. Now if only if it's having the opacity, then only it will enter this area over here. Now instead of giving it as a value as 50, now if you remember, we are capturing the user input over here, which is in the form of let's say opacity value, which is something that we are also passing with this post message. Now to use this opacity value in our test.ts file, what we can do is we can make use of this object msg and write the value over here which is being passed from that HTML file. Now by doing this, we will have access to the exact same value which user enters over here. Now once we get that value, we can apply that value to the user selected node. Now this is how we can manipulate the opacity of that particular node. But there is one important thing which I want to talk about over here before I go and run this plugin. Now opacity property in terms of Figma plugin development is handled in a different way compared to the way we handle it in our properties panel. So in the properties panel, we will have opacity from the range of 0 to 100. But when dealing with opacities in Figma plugin development, it will be from the range of 0 to 1. So 0 being the zero opacity, 0.1 being 10%, 0.2 being 20%, and like that 0.8 being 80%, and 1 being 100%. So going by that logic, we need to convert our number, which can be from 0 to 100 to a decimal value. So what we can do is, let's say if a user is entering a value as 50, we need to divide it by 100 so that we get 0.5 and we can feed that to our Figma plugin environment. Now once we do that, we will be able to successfully update the opacity of the selected user layer. Now let's go ahead and save this plugin, and let's run this in our Figma test environment file. So I have created some layers, some rectangles and some circles for us to try out our plugin. So you can also go ahead and create any rectangle or a circle for you to manipulate and for you to test out the plugin which we have just created. So let's go ahead and select one of this layer. Let's say I select this one and I run my plugin, which is plugins dot development environment, and test plugin FPD. Now, as you can see, this is exactly the same UI which we had mentioned in our test.html file, which is over here. There is a heading, there's an input field, there are two buttons, and yeah, that's what we all wanted, right? So if you see, it is asking for us to select the opacity which we want to manipulate, or which we want to apply on the selected layer that we have over here. So let's say if I give let's say 65 and I click on apply opacity, now you can see the opacity is updating over here. Now instead of doing it for just single layer, let's try and see how it works when I select multiple layers. So let's say I select all the rectangles and I go ahead and run the plugin. Let's see what happens. Now here again, I can give the opacity value which I want to update, let's say 10%. And when I click on apply opacity, the opacity is applied, and you can see that now the updated opacity is 10%. And this is all happening by just few line of code which we have defined in VS Code. Now, this is how you can manipulate the user selected layer by this method called figma.currentPage.selection. Now, if you remember, this is only one way of manipulating the contents of user's document. We also have another way where instead of asking the user to select the layer which they want to manipulate, we can just check all the layers in the document and manipulate all those layers, or apply a condition to manipulate all those layers. So without having to ask to the user to select those layers. So let's go ahead and comment this code, and let's write a code to see how we can select all the layers present in the document without making user select it manually. So what we can do is we can actually, as you remember, we want to work under this method, which is apply opacity. We can comment down the code which we have just written for the current page selection. To comment this down, you can select the line of code and you can hit command and slash, and it will just comment down the code. And let's go ahead and write the code to select all the layers in the document. So again, to do that, we will have to first of all store that all the layers which we are getting in form of array into a variable. So let's say I call this nodes, and I write this function called figma.currentPage.findAll. Right now, this will give me all the layers in my document, and without having to ask to the user to select them, I will have the access to all those layers. Now to manipulate them, what I need to do is I need to just run a for loop, which is like constant node of nodes, and I just need to again copy this same exact line of code which we had done earlier, which is if the opacity is present, and then I want the layer to have the new opacity which I am giving as a user input. So just to again repeat what exactly is happening over here is I am getting the selection of all the layers which are present in the document, and then I'm traversing on all the layers through this for loop which we have over here. And after that, I'm just checking if the opacity property is present in the node or not. If it is present, then I'm applying the new opacity which is being given to us as a user input. So the difference in this code and the previous code that we have over here is that in this one, we don't have to ask the users to select the layers previously. They just have to run the plugin and it will manipulate all the layers present in the document. So let's go ahead and save this and run our plugin and see what happens. So as you can see, I don't have any layers selected right now. I'll just go and run my plugin. Now I have the opacity over here as 50. Let's maybe make it as 10% so that it's evident. Now let's run this plugin. And now as you can see, it has updated the opacity for all the layers present to 10%. Now this was not something which we had selected, but it just went and scanned all the layers present in the document, and it just applied the opacity to all of them. Now, what if you don't want to manipulate all of them? What if you only want to manipulate some of them? Let's say, what if you only want to manipulate the layers which are rectangles, or the layers which are only ellipses? Now there's an option to do that as well. What we can do is we can slightly tweak our code which we have over here. Now, as you can see, now this is where I'm getting the access to all the layers which are present in the document, right? Now I can write a condition over here, which is let's say node type equals to a rectangle. Now this will check for me whether the node is rectangle or not, and only if it is rectangle then it will run this line of code. Otherwise it will ignore all the other type of nodes which we have. So let's save this and go ahead and run our plugin again. Now there is a shortcut which I want to point out before we again go ahead and run our plugin. So anytime when you want to run your previous or your last plugin that you had run, what you can do is you can hit Option Command and P, and it will run the previous plugin which was last opened. So now that we have our plugin open, let's go ahead and click on Apply Opacity, and you can see that it is only applying the opacity to the rectangles and ignoring the ellipses because of the condition which we had applied over here. Now, this is how you can manipulate all the elements of a document without asking the users to select them manually, and you can also apply the conditions to them. Now, what if I don't want to manipulate all of them? What if I only want to manipulate the first layer which is, selected after this condition? Now, assume, what if I don't want to manipulate all the rectangles which are presented, but I only want to manipulate the first one which is there? Now to do that, there is again one more option in Figma. Now let's go ahead and just comment down this code which we have over here, and let's write the code for that. Now what we can do to get the selection of only one single layer is we can again create a node array, and inside that we can write figma.currentpage.find, but instead of all we can write find one, which we have over here. And this is pretty much self-explanatory that it will only find one layer or one node which will have this particular condition. Now we can just go ahead and apply the opacity to this node because it's just a single value which is returned with find one, and we don't need to run a for loop for that. So again, we can check if this opacity is there in this node or not, and then if it is there, then we can just simply update that opacity, and you can just simply copy this, and let's see how this works. Now what I'll do is I'll just revert this back. I'll just make this 100 again, and I'll run the plugin by the shortcut Option Command P. Now ideally what it should do is it should update this first rectangle which we have over here, because we have only applied find one and not find all. So let's give this a value of 10 and let's see what happens. Now, as you can see, what is happening is that it is only updating the first one and ignoring the remaining rectangles and the ellipses. And this is how you can use find one and find all to traverse through any available element in a document. And that's how you can just select the existing element and manipulate it by these two ways. Either it's a user selected, or either if it's available directly in the document. Now, moving on to the next important thing, which I feel is something that you will very frequently do with while dealing with any other plugin, is that is adding something from scratch using plugin. So now that you know how you can manipulate existing elements, it's also important for you to add new elements or to add new layers on your users artboard when they are working with your plugin. So let's go ahead and try that as well. So as you can see, there are multiple steps to do that. You can first of all create an element that you want to add in users document, and then you can pass that element in the user document by this method called append child. Now this is going to be really simple code, so we'll just quickly go and try this out. So going back to our VS Code, what we can do is we can actually comment this out, and we can also move to our HTML file and comment out few sections which we don't need anymore. So we don't need the input field, as we're not manipulating anything, we are only adding the new things. And we can maybe call this as create rectangle, and rename this to create rectangle. And we can actually duplicate this button and make a similar button which will create ellipses for us, and we can give it an ID called create ellipse. So this is how we can create two buttons. And now what we can do is, instead of using the apply opacity over here, we can rename this to create rectangle. And now that we don't have the input field anymore, we can just comment down this as well using command slash, and we can change the type of the message to create rectangle, and we don't need to pass the value anymore because we're not capturing it with the input field. And what we can also do is we can just duplicate this and paste it over here, and this one we can call create ellipse. And now what we can do is we can again change this to create ellipse because we want the types of the method to be unique. And now what we have to do is we just have to make use of this information and change few line of code in our this plugin over here. We can actually go and delete this comments as well because we are no more going to use them. So one of our message type could be create a rectangle. Let's just see if we are writing it correct. Let's just copy it and paste it over there. And the other one can be this is how we can actually create rectangles and ellipses and just add new elements from scratch. So let's write a code for that. Now to create any layer in Figma, I would first of all suggest you to make use of the documentation section which they have provided, and it's really useful because it covers the attributes and the list of properties that you can manipulate in this particular layer, because it might differ from layer to layer because not every layer will have all the properties that you want to manipulate. Now let's go back to Figma documents and see how they are guiding us to create these layers. Like you can find ellipse node or rectangle node over here. So let's see what are the things that we should keep in mind while creating this. So there are properties like opacity, there are properties like corner radius, there are properties like fills that we can manipulate, and I think there's one more property where you can also resize the rectangle that we are creating. So let's go ahead and try out these properties. So again, highly recommended, please make use of this documentation section. It will have a list of all the properties that you can manipulate, but we are going to try out only few of them for now. So let's go back to our VS Code and write the code to create this rectangle. Now what we will do is we will create a variable first and we will write the code to create the rectangle over here. Now this will return a value which we will append to our Figma document. Now to do that, what you can do is you can write Figma dot current page dot append child. Now again, breaking this down, what you're doing is you're telling it that on the current page you want to append a child, and then you're giving the detail of that child. Now in this case, the child would be rectangle variable which we have just created over here. And now this will create a rectangle and simply add it to your Figma document. Now let's go ahead and see how this is working for us. Let's save both the files and let's go and run our plugin again. So let's do one thing. We will delete all the layers which we have right now, and as you can see now it's empty, and we can run the plugin by option command P. And now as you can see, the updated UI has this option for creating rectangle and creating ellipse, and again the option to exit. So let's go ahead and click on create rectangle and see what it does. So as you can see, it has created a new rectangle for me. And now you might be wondering, why do we have 100 by 100 size and a default color? So these are some of the default settings for the rectangle node whenever you are creating a rectangle, but definitely you can manipulate these properties, and that's what we are going to do now. So let's go back to our VS Code and define some of the properties for this rectangle before we add it to our document. So I'm going to write my code before we add it, because writing it after adding it's not going to make any sense. So let's say I want my rectangle to have a size of 150 by 150. So I can use this function over here, which is called resize, and it takes two values, which is width and height, and I can define the width and height over here. Now I can use this another method which is called fills, and I can actually write an array over here because this method takes value of array, and I can define the type of the fill which I want. So I want actually a solid fill, and post that I can also define the RGB values which I have, let's say color. Now this will create a rectangle for me with a black color. So let's see, and after that I can also add corner radius. Let's say rectangle dot corner radius, and I will write 4, and it will apply 4 to all 4 sides. And now I think we have defined some good basic properties, and let's go ahead and save it and run our plugin again and see what happens. So we'll delete this one and we'll close the plugin and restart it with option command P. and let's create a rectangle. So as you can see, it has created a rectangle for me, which is 150 cross 150, and it has a corner radius of 4 and a black color, which we had just defined over here. So this is how you can create a new layer or a new node and attach it to your user's document who's using your plugin. Now let's go ahead and write a similar code for our ellipse as well. What we can do is we can actually just copy this and we can paste it over here. So in case if the message type is create ellipse, which will come if a user clicks on create ellipse, what should happen is it should, instead of creating a rectangle, it should create an ellipse. So let's go ahead and write the code for that. And as you guess, the code is pretty similar, which is create ellipse. So we can go ahead and rename this variable name again over here from rect to ellipse, and mostly properties like resize, fills, and corner radius apply to ellipse, but I don't think we need corner radius in this case. And let's see how your ellipse is coming out once we append it into our document. Let's save and let's run our plugin again. We can delete this rectangle, close it, and restart with Option Command P and click on create ellipse. So as you can see, this creates a black ellipse for me, which is 150 cross 150. And this is how you can append or create new elements from scratch and add them to your user's document. And that brings us towards the end of this video. I hope now you're familiar with the two important approaches that you should be aware about while creating your plugin. And now you can manipulate and create new elements from scratch. So go ahead and try that out and share with me your experience in the comment section so that I can help you out in case of any blockers. But otherwise, that was it for this video, and thanks for watching.